On a warm afternoon in March 1994, a presidential candidate walked into a crowd of thousands in one of Mexico's poorest neighborhoods. Within minutes, in front of cameras broadcasting live, he was shot in the head at point-blank range. The shooter was tackled immediately and arrested at the scene. But video footage showed something the authorities couldn't explain: evidence of a second weapon, a second trajectory, and a second shooter who vanished into the chaos. Only one man went to prison. This is the story of Luis Donaldo Colosio, and what happened in Tijuana that day remains one of the most controversial political assassinations in modern history. Before we go any further, please hit like so more people can see this case, and subscribe to the channel with all notifications on, so you never miss a cold case investigation. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Luis Donaldo Colosio Murrieta was born on February 10, 1950, in Magdalena de Quino, a small town in the northern Mexican state of Sonora. He came from a family with deep political roots, a family of Italian and Spanish descent that had been active in local politics for generations. From an early age, Colosio was known for his intelligence, his ambition, and his genuine concern for the poor and marginalized. He studied economics at the prestigious Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey, one of Mexico's top universities, and went on to pursue graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. He also conducted research at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria before returning to Mexico with a vision for his country's future. In 1972, at just 22 years old, Colosio joined the Institutional Revolutionary Party, known as the PRI, which had controlled Mexican politics for more than 6 decades. He rose quickly through the ranks. In 1979, he joined the Secretariat of Budget and Planning, working under a man who would later become president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari. In 1985, he was elected to Congress, representing his home district in Sonora. By 1988, he was managing Salinas's presidential campaign, and he himself was elected to the Senate. His career was meteoric. When Salinas became president, he appointed Colosio to increasingly powerful positions. First, as chairman of the PRI's National Executive Committee, essentially the second most powerful position in the party. Then, in 1992, Salinas created a new cabinet position, Secretary of Social Development, and gave it to Colosio. It was a role tailor-made for his skills and his passion. He oversaw programs aimed at reducing poverty, improving infrastructure in rural areas, and giving marginalized communities a voice in government. He was widely respected, even by his political opponents. And by late 1993, it was clear that Salinas was preparing to name Colosio as his successor. In Mexico at that time, the president essentially handpicked the next presidential candidate for the PRI. And because the PRI had never lost a presidential election, being named the party's candidate was tantamount to being named the next president. On November 28, 1993, President Salinas made it official. Luis Donaldo Colosio would be the PRI's candidate for the 1994 presidential election. At 43 years old, Colosio was about to become one of the most powerful men in Mexico. But 1994 was not a normal year in Mexico. On January 1st, just weeks after Colosio's nomination, an armed indigenous guerrilla group called the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN, launched an uprising in the southern state of Chiapas. They seized control of several towns, demanded land reform and indigenous rights, and captured the world's attention. The uprising exposed the deep inequalities and corruption that had festered under decades of PRI rule. The country was shaken. And suddenly, Colosio's campaign was overshadowed by the crisis in Chiapas and the government's negotiations with the rebels. On March 6, 1994, Colosio delivered a speech in Mexico City that would change everything. It was the anniversary of the founding of the PRI, and thousands of party members and supporters gathered in front of the monument to the Mexican Revolution to hear him speak. What they heard shocked them. Colosio spoke bluntly about the problems facing Mexico: government corruption, abuse of power, the neglect of indigenous communities, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. He called for real change, not just rhetoric. He spoke of the people's independence from the government, of the need for transparency and accountability. It was a direct challenge to the old guard of the PRI, and many believed it was a message aimed at President Salinas himself. The speech was controversial. Some praised Colosio for his courage and his honesty. Others within the party saw it as a betrayal, a breaking of ranks. Rumors began to circulate that Colosio was losing President Salinas's support, that he might be replaced as the candidate. The speculations centered on Manuel Camacho, the foreign secretary who was leading the negotiations with the Zapatistas. Camacho was popular, charismatic, and closely aligned with Salinas. For weeks, the political world in Mexico was consumed by the question, would Camacho challenge Colosio for the nomination? Finally, on March 22, Camacho held a press conference and announced that he would not run for president. He would focus on the peace process in Chiapas. The nomination was secure. Colosio was the candidate. Relief swept through his campaign. The next day, March 23, 1994, Colosio was scheduled to hold a rally in Tijuana, a sprawling border city in the state of Baja California. The location was symbolic: Lomas Taurinas, a poor, working-class neighborhood near the airport, the kind of place where Colosio's message of social justice resonated most strongly. The afternoon was warm and sunny. By 5 o'clock, thousands of people had gathered in an open dirt lot in Lomas Taurinas. There were families, children, elderly people, workers who had taken time off to see the man who might be their next president. Colosio arrived with his security team and a group of local PRI officials. The crowd pressed in close, eager to shake his hand, to touch him, to take photographs. It was the kind of chaotic, uncontrolled environment that security experts dread, but it was also the kind of event that Mexican politicians thrived on. Direct contact with the people, no barriers, no distance. Colosio made his way slowly through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, speaking to people. Cameras from local television stations captured the scene. Reporters followed him, recording his every word. And then, at exactly 5:05 in the afternoon, everything changed. A man lunged forward from the crowd. In his hand was a .38 caliber revolver, a weapon that had been purchased in San Francisco and smuggled across the border. The man pressed the gun to the right side of Colosio's head and fired. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the noise of the crowd, but the effect was immediate. Colosio collapsed. Blood poured from his head. People screamed. Security personnel tackled the shooter, wrestled him to the ground, and held him there as pandemonium erupted around them. Within seconds, Colosio's security team surrounded him. They lifted his body and carried him toward a waiting vehicle. There had been plans to airlift him across the border to a hospital in San Diego, just minutes away, where American trauma surgeons could treat him. But those plans were abandoned in the chaos. Instead, he was rushed to Tijuana's General Hospital. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize him, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had entered his skull at close range, causing massive trauma to his brain. At 7:30 that evening, just over 2 hours after the shooting, Luis Donaldo Colosio Murrieta was pronounced dead. The news spread across Mexico within minutes. Television stations interrupted their programming to announce that the presidential candidate had been assassinated. President Salinas, who had been in a meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, abruptly ended the meeting and appeared on national television, his face pale and drawn. He called the killing an act of infamy and promised that those responsible would be brought to justice. Across the country, people were stunned. Political assassinations were not unheard of in Mexico, but the murder of a presidential candidate, in broad daylight, surrounded by cameras and security, was unprecedented. The man who had been tackled at the scene was quickly identified. His name was Mario Alberto Martinez, a 23-year-old factory worker from Tijuana. He lived with his mother, had no criminal record, and by all accounts was not involved in politics. When interrogated, he confessed immediately. He said he had acted alone, that no one had helped him, that he had brought the gun to the rally with the intention of killing Colosio. He claimed he was angry about corruption and injustice, that he wanted to send a message. But his story was vague, his motives unclear. And almost immediately, people began to question whether he was telling the truth. The authorities made a critical error in those first hours. Before presenting Aburto to the media, they shaved his head, gave him a haircut, bathed him, and changed his clothes. When journalists saw him, he looked completely different from the man who had been arrested at the scene. Conspiracy theories exploded. Was this even the same person? Had the real shooter been replaced with a patsy? The government's handling of Aburto only deepened the public's suspicion. As investigators began to analyze the evidence, more troubling details emerged. The autopsy revealed that Colosio had been shot not once, but twice. One bullet had entered the right side of his head, penetrating his skull and causing the fatal injury. But a second bullet had entered his abdomen, traveling upward through his torso. The trajectories of the two bullets were different. They came from different angles. And forensic experts began to question whether one person, firing one weapon in the middle of a chaotic crowd, could have inflicted both wounds. Video footage of the assassination, recorded by multiple cameras, was analyzed frame by frame. It showed Aburto firing from Colosio's right side, at point-blank range to the head. But witnesses at the scene reported hearing two shots, fired within seconds of each other. Some said they had seen a second gun, a second hand emerging from the crowd. Others described seeing a man in a dark jacket, positioned behind Colosio, who fled immediately after the shooting. The theory of a second shooter began to take hold. Investigators focused on Colosio's security team. In the moments before the shooting, as Colosio moved through the dense crowd, his bodyguards had surrounded him. But the formation had broken down. The crowd had pressed in too close. Some of the security personnel had been pushed aside. And in that moment of confusion, the shooter, or shooters, had struck. One of the agents assigned to Colosio's protection that day was a man named Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega. He worked for CISIN, Mexico's civilian intelligence agency. And in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, his behavior raised questions. Sanchez Ortega had been standing close to Colosio when the shots were fired. His clothing was later found to be stained with the candidate's blood. But he had not been involved in transporting Colosio to the hospital, so how had the blood gotten on his clothes? Witnesses reported seeing him flee the scene immediately after the shooting, pushing through the crowd and disappearing. He was briefly detained by local police, but within hours he was released. And then, according to later investigations, he was quietly removed from Tijuana and taken to Mexico City, where his superiors at CISIN arranged for him to go into hiding. For years, the official story remained unchanged. Mario Aburto had acted alone. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 45 years in prison, which he is still serving at a maximum security facility in central Mexico. But Aburto later claimed that he had been tortured into confessing, that he had been beaten and threatened until he agreed to say he had acted alone. He said there were others involved, but he did not know their names. And as the years passed, his story became just one more piece of a puzzle that no one could solve. Multiple investigations were launched. Prosecutors interviewed more than 1,100 witnesses and compiled 47,000 pages of testimony. They examined every theory: that Colosio had been killed by drug traffickers angry at his anti-corruption stance, that he had been betrayed by members of his own party who feared his reformist agenda, that President Salinas himself had ordered the hit to prevent Colosio from dismantling his political network. But no conclusive evidence was ever found. The case was officially closed, but the controversy never ended. And then, decades later, new evidence emerged. In January 2024, Mexico's Attorney General's office announced that it was reopening the investigation. Prosecutors revealed that they had gathered forensic and testimonial evidence pointing to a second shooter. They named Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega, the former CISIN agent, as the primary suspect. They alleged that Sanchez had fired the second shot, the one that struck Colosio in the abdomen, and that his superiors at CISIN, including a man named Genaro Garcia Luna, who later became Mexico's Secretary of Public Security and is now facing drug trafficking charges in the United States, had orchestrated a cover-up to protect him. The Attorney General's office presented ballistic evidence, blood analysis, and witness testimony to a judge, requesting an arrest warrant for Sanchez Ortega. But in a surprising decision, the judge dismissed the evidence and refused to issue the warrant. The judge argued that the video footage of the assassination only showed one shooter, Mario Aburto, and that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a second shot had been fired from a different weapon. The Attorney General's office accused the judge of obstructing justice and announced plans to appeal. Then, on November 9, 2025, federal prosecutors in Tijuana arrested Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega. He was taken into custody and transported to a maximum security prison in central Mexico to await trial. The charges against him have not been fully disclosed, but authorities have confirmed that the arrest is related to the Colosio assassination. After more than 3 decades, the case that shocked Mexico and changed the course of its political history is being reopened. But even with Sanchez Ortega in custody, fundamental questions remain unanswered. If there was a second shooter, who ordered the assassination? Was it drug traffickers, as some have theorized? Was it hardliners within the PRI who feared Colosio's reform agenda? Was it President Salinas, trying to maintain control over the party and the country? Or was it a conspiracy involving multiple factions, each with their own reasons to want Colosio dead? Prosecutors have provided no overarching theory, no clear motive, no definitive explanation. The aftermath of Colosio's death was devastating for his family. His wife, Diana Laura Riojas, was left to care for their 2 young children alone. She became obsessed with uncovering the truth about her husband's murder, filing injunctions and demanding access to investigative files. But on November 18, 1994, just 8 months after her husband was killed, she died. The official cause of death was pancreatic cancer, but the timing fueled more conspiracy theories. President Zedillo, who had replaced Colosio as the PRI's candidate and went on to win the election, did not attend her funeral. Their 2 children were raised by relatives. Colosio's father spent the rest of his life investigating his son's murder, publishing a book about the case in 2004 before passing away in 2010. In February 2021, Colosio's son, Luis Donaldo Colosio Riojas, visited the site of the assassination in Lomas Taurinas. He stood in the same dirt lot where his father had been killed and spoke to the crowd that had gathered. He said he forgave the cowards who had murdered his father. But he also condemned the political class that, as he put it, kidnaps power to serve evil groups and interests. He called for unity and solidarity, the same values his father had championed. The assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio remains one of the most debated and analyzed events in modern Mexican history. Books have been written about it. Documentaries have been made. A Netflix series, released in 2019, examined the conspiracy theories and the evidence. And now, with the arrest of Jorge Antonio Sanchez Ortega, the case is once again front-page news. But whether this arrest will finally bring answers, or simply add another layer to an already impossibly complex mystery, remains to be seen. What is clear is that on March 23, 1994, something went terribly wrong in Lomas Taurinas. A man who might have been president, a man who spoke of justice and reform, was cut down in broad daylight. And for more than 30 years, the people of Mexico have been asking the same question his widow asked when she first heard the news. Who did it? What do you think really happened in this case? Do you believe Mario Aburto acted alone, or was there a larger conspiracy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, but please keep them respectful to Luis Donaldo Colosio and his family. If you'd like to see more cold case investigations like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can learn about these stories. This case remains officially open, and even the smallest detail could matter in the search for truth.